Thank you very much for joining us, everybody, for this Cambridge Digital Humanities Open. Today, we are going to be discussing some of the main challenges of undertaking investigations in the digital age. And our speaker for the CDH Open is Dr. Irving Huerta, who is of Cambridge Digital Humanities. He is a research associate and data school conveners for Cambridge Digital Humanities' two online data schools, which are scheduled for March 2022 and June 2022. His background is in journalism, collaborating with organizations like Forensic Architecture, the International Consortium for Investigative Journalism, and others. He's interested in the intersection between politics, media, and accountability. His research revolves around the politics of uncovering wrongdoing, that is, the struggles of its practitioners, the production of truth, and the transformation of reality. Irving holds a PhD in politics from Goldsmiths University and has taught political communication and investigative journalism in universities and civil organizations such as the Center for Investigative Journalism in the UK and Fundación Gabo in Colombia. The seminar respondents today are also from Forensic Architecture: Cristina Varbia, who is a PhD researcher at Aarhus University, and Robert Trafford, a research coordinator at Forensic Architecture and Share. And it's my pleasure to also introduce both of them. Cristina Varbia is currently a research fellow and formerly the deputy director and lead researcher of Forensic Architecture. She was trained as an architect and has taught at the Architectural Association. She is currently an associate lecturer at the Center for Research Architecture at Goldsmiths University of London and is pursuing her PhD at Aarhus University, where she has received the Novo Nordisk Foundation Scholarship. She is also a fellow at Louisiana Museum of Modern Art and a founding member and the chair of the board of Forensis, the Berlin-based association based in Berlin and established by Forensic Architecture. Robert Trafford, who is the second respondent today, is a research coordinator with Forensic Architecture, a pioneering investigative agency based at Goldsmiths University of London. His role at FA covers open source research and visual investigation, editing and writing for scripts and exhibitions, as well as coordinating investigations. His investigative work with FA has spanned from police violence against US protesters to the extrajudicial killing of civilians by Cameroon's special forces. It has also jointly coordinated investigations into the 2020 terror attack in Hanau, Germany, and 2011 killing of Mark Tarkin by US police, and the agency's acclaimed Triple Chaser investigation, which premiered at the 2019 Whitney Biennial in New York. Robert is trained as an investigative journalist, a graduate of the University of Oxford and City University of London, and prior to joining Forensic Architecture, he was a freelance journalist covering the 2015 refugee crisis from Greece and France. It's a pleasure of Cambridge Digital Humanities to have Irving, Cristina, and Robert with us. And with that, I'm going to hand the floor over to Irving for his presentation.
Thank you very much, Siddharth, and thank you very much also to all of you who are here for this lecture, and obviously to Robert and to Cristina. It is really a pleasure to be sharing this open seminar with them. And I hope that in the next 35 minutes or so, I can just make the case for digital investigations as a transformative practice as a framework for operations in the digital age. So first of all, if you don't mind, just let me start with an epigraph by Enrique Sorno, journalist and poet from Mexico, from his Another Manifesto for an Infrarealist Journalism, just published in 2022. And it goes, that's basically what today is about. To look at the world, but seriously look at it, and then look at it differently, each one of us, because the gaze is lost between the four walls of confinement, in a self-visual diarrhea, in the baptism signal, with the new false prophets and the old false prophets, whose toxic mud, mixture of hate and violence, blurs what we see. Infrarealist journalism, rather than reflecting a political idea, wants to feel the mood of the world and turn it on again with an insurrection of the gaze, of the gazes, and then redo everything. Well, I hope that sets kind of the talk that I want to bring for you. And I hope that you can see my screen. It's just going to be like a visual aid for all of us. So this is what I'm going to be presenting today. This framework that I've been working on for the last 5 years is something that I've been drawing from my own PhD research, and hopefully that I want to also push forward in practice in many different fields of the investigative practice in the digital age. So I'm going to start just a little bit with my experience, just to frame it a little bit, give an introduction what I mean by a framework for digital investigations. I'm going to present the problems for the investigative practice, quick analysis, really. Then some examples or case studies of the ongoing struggle for solutions to do some of these investigative or these investigations in the public interest. And then I'm going to try and explain the three pillars of the framework for investigations, which you can see there. I return to the political, communitarian solidarity, humanitarian truth production, and then probably I would like to end with open possibilities of what we can do, not just, of course, in journalism. After all, we are in digital humanities in Cambridge, and we want to, or that's my aim, to open up in the investigative practice beyond journalistic organizations and journalism ideology as well. Okay. So just very quickly, I just want to say that I am not a pure academic, and I don't pretend to be one. I have a background in journalism for the last 9 or 10 years, and I've been participating in investigations on corruption, human rights violations, and others. Working back in Mexico was difficult in itself, but then after we published the story, we were all fired from the media outlet we were working for, and that brought a lot of frustration and in myself about kind of the ideals of investigative journalism, of trying to supposedly make a difference, have an impact in the world. But then what was happening was that journalists were being fired and suffering the consequences. Well, the character, the person who was found to be doing something or some kind of wrongdoing was enjoying freedom and impunity. That was the Mexican president back then. Anyway, that's kind of where I come from. And just to say that I have an interest in developing a framework because I still believe, after all that frustration, that the investigative practice has something to do for life in society, for how we live together. And yes, just as an introduction, this is the framework that I'm going to try and elaborate. And as you may see, more than a technological response to all the problems of the investigative practice today, of fake news and post-truth, or even the obstacles for investigative journalism, I am trying to push forward for a political position, for a political stance, as it were, or a political drive, a political ethos. And that's composed of three different pillars: a return to political action, a communitarian solidarity, probably at the center of this framework, and then a humanitarian truth production. Just give me some minutes and I'm trying to elaborate on that. Before I go into that, I need to establish what are the problems are for the investigative practice, for this kind of investigations in the public interest that are supposed to bring change or to bring us truth and justice. I have just organized some of these problems in three different themes, but these are not fixed. I'm happy to discuss these three themes for the problems of the investigative practice, as it is done now by journalists, NGOs, and other organizations. So first, you can see that in the digital age, we have the individual gain over the public interest, right? In the digital age, this becomes a real struggle, as we can just dwell in many different descriptions of this stage. I'm very, very happy with describing some of them as following: a torrent of information, as Todd Littling will say, right? The problem is not anymore the lack of information, but the abundance of it. We cannot really make sense of all the things that are taking place at the same time, with so many sources, with so many contradicting voices, with so many multimedia kind of flashes coming and going. That's one of the things. Secondly, people like Zuboff have talked about this stage of surveillance capitalism, right? Which is not just that corporations are profiting from our information, but also that some of our information is being used to even alter the behavior of people, those who are using the internet, which I think it can be also described in other terms, for instance, by Couldry with something called data colonialism. I'm happy to later on probably touch upon that, but it is this idea that there is some progress, some advancement in the territory of our digital entities for private profit, and also kind of as a spin-off of this surveillance authoritarianism, right? With the example, the most salient example being Pegasus, which is this software which was infecting cell phones, devices from journalists and NGOs all over the world with some authoritarian goals in mind. That's probably one of the first problems. Secondly, I have put on that category a continuous neoliberal practice or continuous neoliberal practices in the media as both an economic and a political system, which is continuing up to this day, which has been on the rise, well, has been over there for more than 3 decades. And we see this mainly in the places where supposedly journalists will be doing this kind of investigations, right? They working for a media corporation, they will have to strive and fight back some of these things. So for instance, there is very big enthusiasm for collaboration in journalism, but within the same media organizations, there are counter strategies for collaborating. So we hear about all these initiatives, for instance, like the Panama Papers or the ICIJ in Washington, trying to come up with amazing collaborations between investigative journalists around the world. And yet within the media organizations, there are some obstacles for collaboration because there is competition between them, because there are certain assumptions about how a media corporation should work that is kind of curbing this collaboration. Following with this model, the kind of investigative journalism that is being kind of promoted and finds a lot of obstacles because of a neoliberal model is, this unit of small groups of journalists working on investigations, but just done by very few, is so that the rest can do shallow reporting or clickbait, and that's problematic in itself. And the following are probably more salient in other places of the global south, but it's true also in the global north, with people who are trying to do these investigations, working for media organizations or freelancers or NGOs with low salaries and poor labor conditions in reality. And I've also found from my own research very strong hostility to unionization. Unions are regarded more and more as something that is against the interest of the corporations that they're working for. And then thirdly, for that last column there, these obstacles also operate at the level of ideology, which I claim that is linked to a specific media model, is a certain idea of what investigations should like. This paradigmatic case, the North American case with the Watergate scandal, and the 2 journalists doing these investigations being so prevalent and so dominant all around the world. But it has ideological assumptions that are limiting the scope of the investigative practice. So there is, along these lines, at the ideological level, there is an unresolved tension with objective reporting. There is always the drive to present information in a way that seems to be objective and impartial, whereas at the same time, they're trying to take some measures not to appear as someone who is kind of retracted or abstracted from reality. So it's a kind of an unresolved reality, an unresolved tension, mainly in the North American media, that is then affecting also other places in the world, other fields in the world. Following also at the ideological level, it is, again, this idea of investigative reporting in itself being an obstacle to the investigations, because it is embedded in just the name of an investigative journalist, someone who is dedicated to do this work, whereas the rest would be doing shallow work or would be doing daily reporting. It is effectively creating an elite of reporters within this organization. So it is elitist in itself. That's why I'm claiming that it is at the ideological level. And then we have a problem that is starting with the funding model, of course, right? Which is, the historical trace that we can have from investigative journalism or journalism in general, which is an industrial model from the 20th century, passing by to the commercial media that followed, and then more recently NGOs also entering into the kind of panorama or the scene of the investigative practice, but is still adopting certain characteristics of this funding model, which is competition mainly, for funds that are not illimited, are not infinite. And then finally, and I think this is going to be important for our further discussion, for one of the pillars, and also for the discussion with my respondents, a visual fetish with the news. What I mean by this is that what is newsworthy is what we can see, and then what we can see is what is true, and we can privilege what it is visual, and it is so salient in the digital age. So some of these are the obstacles that we have for the investigative practice to truly have a transformative effect in society. And as I said, not just for journalists, but then journalism, the journalism world, is having an impact in what NGOs, trade unions, and other organizations are also doing. Just put this quotation on data colonialism in case we wanted to go to it, but I'm not going to dwell on that. Probably what I'm going to dwell on is this quotation by Accardo, just to show how this can be kind of at the core of the practice without us being aware of this at the ideological level. And I'm going to read. There is something we cannot reproach to journalists, save for exceptional cases, doing their job in good faith, in internalizing a system logic so well, they willingly adopt what it commands. They act by mutual agreement without coming to an agreement. Their inspiration community makes conspiracy unnecessary. All I'm trying to say is that without realizing we are adopting some of the given assumptions of the practice, like this unresolved tension with objectivity, these ideas of competition, and the visual as well. And I think that can be summarized by this image over here, which I would like you to look at it right now, and just let me point at it and say that this is probably the least newsworthy image that you have ever seen. It is not catchy. There is no movement there. That's something you wouldn't see on a newspaper. That's not something you will see shown on a screen. And yet, it is probably one of the most important images for the enforced or the fight against the enforced disappearance in Sinaloa, Mexico. And this image was taken by a reporter over there, trying to prove that in that place there is a mass grave, and the relatives who are trying to find, the relatives, dead or alive, they're striving to do it. He took this picture, the least appealing picture, and he shared it with NGOs, and he shared it with relatives as well. This is someone who is doing investigations and is going against all the assumptions, the given assumptions of the practice. So in many respects, this image is anathema and is showing the problem that we see, because we don't see this picture very often, right? So this journalist committed the sin, the journalistic sin of taking a picture that is not very salient and also shared it with NGOs, which is kind of akin to assume himself as an activist. Now I want to move on to some of the ongoing struggles for solutions. And I am drawing from 2 case studies that I've researched before, looking for answers on what they have been trying to do for advancing an investigative agenda, for trying to do investigations that have an impact in the public interest. The first one is Periodistas de a Pie. It's a group of journalists in Mexico who was created in the middle of the war on drugs, and in the middle also of all the threats to journalists, making Mexico one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a journalist. They came up with this organization, and they went against the legacy media and all the practices that they had in some of the mainstream media that they used to work for. And this is actually one of the main things that I want to point out from them. They were against political, economic, and legacy media systems. They created this space where they could do the investigations that they wanted to do, not just because they wanted to sell issues of the newspaper, or they wanted clicks. They wanted to do these investigations because they wanted to have some impact in society and achieve social justice. A second thing that was very interesting from what they did is that they understood, they even talked about it, that their own labor conditions were affecting the investigative practice. And that's something key to some of the efforts that we see on investigations around the world today. The conditions of those who are working on this need to be addressed. They understood then that their labor conditions were having an impact on the kind of investigations that they were trying to come up with. Then on a different point, they also used a strategic political action. They did not only publish something, they did not only organize themselves, they also organized manifestations and even lobbying of lawmakers. So it was truly an organization that was organically going beyond the professional role of those who are supposed to be dealing with the news. So that political action was key to advance some of the things that they did. So for instance, they influenced a new legislation to protect journalists in Mexico, which was very important. Another point is the production of social justice, the production of stories for social justice, which is super important because they were not only happy with having stories that were going to be discussed in the public sphere. They wanted to produce stories so that they could have an impact in society. And lastly, and probably the most important point from this case study, is that against all these given assumptions of the practice, against neoliberal practices of individuality, they tried Communitarian Solidarity. They were a group of journalists and friends trying to think and protect themselves together from labor conditions, from the threats, external threats, and even looking after themselves at the personal level. They were looking after their families. And just going to read something that a journalist told me from Periodistas de a Pie to show this. And this is what she told me. One of the things that I have defended the most is the network community model. Just trying to point out that this is what I'm trying to say when I'm claiming that this is a community or a communitarian solidarity. And we were very aware of it, that's what she says. From the very beginning, from that first state, we had long discussions lasting hours. It's a statement rather. We started, say, 7 p.m. when we had finished work, and we finished our meetings around 2 or 4 a.m. But on top of that, most of them had children. So we managed to set up a group in charge of looking after the children, while the rest could discuss in the meetings. We were always aware of those who were moms, and that was a very strong bond of solidarity. That gives you another level of bond, to be honest. This is just a token for you to show the level of involvement that they had with each other, and that was at a personal level. Some of them told me also that they continue to just check on everyone, or the kind of close group, almost on a weekly basis, just to check that everyone is all right and having conversations. Now let me go on to the limitations that I saw from this group. And I think we can learn from this as well. Although it is a great project, it had some limitations because of even the decisions that they made. in their aim to come up with this group, they had to resort to become an NGO or a charity, as it were, in Mexico, because they needed funds to operate, to resort to international funds of the likes of Open Society Foundations or MacArthur Foundations. I'm not demonizing any of that at the moment. I'm just saying that they had to do it in order to operate. And that brought some problems for them. That limited their work. Because of that, their own constitution and the own Mexican laws limited them not to address labor issues. So they were not able to defend a journalist who was in some sort of a fight with their employer, or they were not able to protect someone in a similar way in which a union would do it. They would just completely forgo all the work that they had done up until that day. The other thing that was curtailed as well was their political action. They could not lobby anymore. They could not work with a congressman. And they also limited, this is not something that was limiting from their constitution, but they did it consciously. They limited the way in which they were having manifestations or protests in the streets. They decided not to do it because they thought it was not suitable for an NGO to do it anymore. Just to point out some of the limitations. And this is the second example, or the second case study that I want to bring to the fore, which is Forensic Architecture's Plataforma Ayotzinapa. So as you may know, Forensic Architecture is a research agency based in Goldsmiths University, and it's a very unorthodox organization. It's composed of architects, artists, journalists, filmmakers. Is truly interdisciplinary. And they use visual methods to investigate cases of political violence or human rights abuses, etc. And they have worked in cases, for instance, bombings in the Strip of Gaza, or also some centers of torture in Africa, or in this case, the Ayotzinapa case in Mexico, which is a case in which I was also participating in, along with Christina and Robert. And I chose it as a case study because I think it is paradigmatic in many ways, and it's useful to see how investigations can be carried out, and also some of the limitations of the work that we did, right? So it was, I looked at it in a kind of a retrospective to see what we can learn and how we can move forward. So first, let me just quickly address some of the benefits that we can draw from this organization, and specifically from Plataforma Ayotzinapa. And Plataforma Ayotzinapa was a platform that was an investigative platform trying to tell the story of the 43 disappeared students in Mexico, which is hideous and horrendous case in Mexico of 43 students who were enforced disappeared in 2014. The official investigation from the government says that criminal organizations kidnapped them, and then they killed them and they were burned in a dump. But this investigation, and that's the problem, is full of holes, full of contrasting narratives, of conflicting narratives. And there is where the work of forensic architecture was very useful. And the platform's so relevant because it's a platform that is telling the story from the side of the victims, from the side of the survivors, and from the relatives of the victims who witnessed some of these things, some of these events. And there are a number of things that we can learn from the work of forensic architecture by coming up with this platform as both an account and a platform for investigation. So one is that they knew, forensic architecture knew, that Ayotzinapa, the Ayotzinapa case, was a paradigmatic case. It is a case that is showing a cracking trust in Mexican society and the incapacity of the state to deliver justice. Secondly, and this is kind of a political stance, as it were, and even an approach for investigation as well, it is the use of counter investigations. Eyal Weizman, who is the founder of forensic architecture, has pushed this approach in many organizations, and sorry, in many cases, not just in this one, but it's the counter investigations approach, which means that they counter hegemonic narratives with investigations that are based on alternative narratives, or those who have been, like the victims of the Ayotzinapa case, have been left behind. So they are trying to contest these narratives, these hegemonic narratives, precisely when there is, with a hegemonic narrative, is so full of contradictions, and there are so many lies within it. Another thing that I have found out in forensic architecture Plataforma Ayotzinapa is a drive or a kind of an impetus that is given by empathic solidarity. So from some of my colleagues during the investigation, I found something similar to Communitarian Solidarity, and that was an empathic solidarity. So they were empathic while they were investigating the case. They felt that if they did their best work, something could happen that could benefit some of the people who were affected by this, and that was something good to see. And next is something that forensic architecture is doing, and probably is going to be relevant for some of those of you who are working on legitimacy for discourse or even documents. So with the aim of providing with some degree of certainty for the investigation, they have tried to come up with open verification, which means that all the investigations that have been carried out, they're open to be scrutinized. The methods, the methodology, the software, even the data sets that were used are open to be scrutinized. And that's something very important. And lastly, something that we did for Plataforma Ayotzinapa was that with these conflicting narratives, we labeled the narratives. And this is important, and this is quite relevant because it worked almost as in a microcosmos of fake news, because we realized that not all the narratives were or had the same value. So by labeling what narrative had what value, for instance, if a narrative was coming from someone who was exposed to torture, for instance, did not have the same value as the testimony from someone who was a survivor. So the naming and labeling is an important thing. Naming is more referred to actually naming or trying to make sense of groups of events, right? So for instance, we were able to name that what happened, there was coordination. We named that bunch of events a coordination or the escalation of events or of violence. So some of the things that we can learn. And then some of the limitations of Plataformas Ayotzinapa. And I would say that first, some of the work that Plataforma Ayotzinapa, although it is great, although it is very innovative in many ways, forensic architecture cannot really invent the wheel. Again, there's a lot of overlap with lots of journalism theory that is trying to achieve the same thing. So for instance, the journalism of attachment is one of them, journalism of peace, right? Trying to have an intervention, a political intervention there, and take a stance. So that's something to bear in mind, and try to learn actually from some of those examples and those theorizations from the past to continue with investigative practice beyond media organizations. There is another problem with the model as well, in which forensic architecture can operate, which is a project-based approach or project-based funding approach. So forensic architecture works very well with a closed team, but then it hires people whenever it is pertinent to do it, whenever you need a certain person to work on this, on that, but that there is a lot of rotation in this team, which means that yes, for instance, some of the issues that I've talked before, they're not completely resolved here, because labor issues, for instance, wouldn't be sorted out with sufficiency here. And lastly, probably the most important notes or limitations that I see is that it can build on the fetishization of the visual or the cult of seeing, right? This thing that I mentioned before, that news media outlets are so focused on, which is what we can see. And probably just to be clear of what I mean, I would like to read out loud this by Moolman. She called it the cult of seeing. I'm just calling it the fetishization of the image for all the reasons that I'm going to explain, but let me read first. The truth is visible, Among the major rituals of journalism, which make it possible to present facts acceptable to all, that is not reducible to a single point of view, but objectified, we need to emphasize the use of the sense of sight. From the beginning, unifying journalism seems to have relied on the eye as opposed to the voice as a means of objectification, to unify, to be collectively received as a group of facts and not of singular opinions. The newspaper had to provide something to see. A fact is made visible to all. There is this drive again, right, to make it visually appealing, and what we see is what is true. And I think it's problematic, I mean, for the reasons that I've mentioned before, because it is leading us to believe that only what we can see is true, and also on choosing cases probably that are more feasible because what we can visualize from them is going to be more appealing, right? There is the other danger as well of focusing too much on the aesthetics of it rather than what we can investigate. So those are some of the limitations. I'm aware of time and I have probably 3 minutes more, and I'm just drawing to conclusion. So what can we then draw from those problems, the case studies with their great benefits and its limitations? I am trying to push forward this framework from those examples, my own experience as well, embedded, situated if you want. And these are some of the pillars that I'm trying to present. So first pillar for this framework of operations, which is more political rather than a technological solution, is a return to the political, or a return to political action, which for journalism is totally going back to all the traditions of more politically committed journalism, but in other realms can also be helpful and could resonate. So this means that all the investigative practice, all the investigative endeavors could have a clear political objective, could have clear political goals. They can use the media strategically, not do away with it, but use them strategically. That's something that Periodistas de a pie and forensic architecture has done very well. They have understood the news cycle and how it operates, and then use it strategically. Organization as well is super important, as Periodistas de a pie did to protect themselves even. So it's in itself a recognition of a political ethos. Secondly, and as I said, probably at the center of this framework is a communitarian solidarity, which resonates with the empathic solidarity that I found in forensic architecture, which is not just collaboration at the professional level, but at the personal level. It is this empathy, right, with the other. And this is when an investigative practice can become something that is beyond journalism, and it's not just in the media organizations. It is something that can be, and it's actually happening already, an interplay between the activist and the artist and the academic and the journalist. So it's a connection between the people and the people. And finally, humanitarian truth production. And this pillar has to do with a departure from the fetishization of the image. That is not to say that we should abandon all the very useful 3D models and the visualizations that we have to represent things, but it does mean that the production that we come up with is based on the political goals that we have talked before, right? We are trying to achieve justice with this, and we're not just taking the case because it is something appealing to the eye. It is then a production for social justice, and is talked through, or is feeding from the human experience. So it's not just the data sets, and it's not just the machines, but a true human experience. It has to do with what forensic architecture did as well with the naming and labeling of the events in Ayotzinapa. So this is then the framework for investigations, for the investigative practice that I would like to push forward, trying to build upon the work of others, the struggles that others have been going through, and also trying to evangelize, as it were, you know, the artist, the academic, for joining investigations, and then trying to do this kind of practice with a political purpose, with a political aim in mind. This is obviously for life in common, right? So that's those are the three pillars: a return to political action, a communitarian solidarity, and a humanitarian truth production. What this involves, and with this I'm finishing, is just the open possibilities. What does this mean then? What can we do? Well, this can mean a place where anyone can investigate, where actually everyone should investigate. So it can be the scholar, the artist, the worker. Can mean also taking over the means of data harvesting in the public interest. Can also mean a place where truth is produced to change the status quo in the public interest. And this is just an idea that I'm citing, not necessarily stealing, but almost from Weisman and Fuller, right? That again, the studio of the artist and the lab of the scientist is there together, and it's probably the same place producing things in the public interest. And also beyond media corporations and beyond journalistic ideology, and this is important for me personally at the personal level, it's not just the ideological assumptions that I had as a journalist, but also actually opening it up to form horizontal communities that are contesting the truth. And obviously, well, one of those possibilities is some of the work that we've been doing at Cambridge Digital Humanities with the data schools, with both the Cultural Heritage Data School and the Social Data School, which is, I mean, work in progress, but it's just one of the possibilities. And well, with that, I finish and I just give way to the respondents. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that, Irving, for that deeply political conversation on the possibilities of digital and forensic journalism, and also for your staging of empathy and human connection and building solidarity in journalistic practice. I'm going to really invite our two respondents. The order that I have in front of me is Robert, followed by Christina, but if one of you is more prepared than the other, then that's really up to you.
Sure, that sounds good to me. Always better not to follow Christina in conversation. Thanks very much, Irving. That was a really fascinating presentation. Yeah, as somebody who comes to forensic architecture with a journalistic background, perhaps only the second person to come to forensic architecture with a journalistic background after Irving, it really resonates with me very deeply, the presentation that you've given there, and I think is an extremely accurate summation of certainly coming out of a journalistic background which is centered around reporting in the UK and this journalistic ideology of the UK media. I find what you've said extremely incisive and very astute description of the problems that journalism in the UK finds itself beholden to. I do feel like we are beholden to a system logic, is exactly the right way to describe it, a system logic which is self-destructive largely and counterproductive. I think most clearly I see that in the avowed apolitical nature of journalism in the UK. And I think the point that you raise about this return to political action is exactly right, and is something which is sorely missing from the journalistic class and the training for the journalistic class, which is sort of embodied by the UK media currently. I wanted to ask you about the sort of the praise that you gave to your two case studies in terms of that and our ability to use media strategically, to understand the rules of media and to use it strategically, because I think it's right in a sense, and I think it's it's certainly someone growing up as a journalist and growing into forensic architecture. It's been a particularly exciting part of that intellectual development, understanding how, in fact, that field can be used. But the other people who know how to use the media strategically are those that our director, Eyal Weissman, has called the insurgents against truth, let's say the sort of political right, the new right and the far right, those who are looking to use the breakdown of established models of truth production to push what has been called a dark epistemology, or a kind of a post-truth, an anti-truth movement behind which the human rights violations of the 21st century are concealed, and many other wrongs and rights violations besides. So I wonder what you think about this. That we seem to be in a situation where your sort of your proposition for the use of media strategically is something which this new breed of media engaged investigators, let's say investigators in a media sort of adjacent ecosystem, are aware of and are using strategically, but also it's precisely those people whose denialism, whose negationism, and whose violence we are looking to investigate are also adept at manipulating and deploying, I suppose, in their own service.
Sure. Do you want me to respond now, or should I do it after?
No, I think, Irving, if you want to say something, you should certainly say it now, and then we'll move over to Christina.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Robert, for that comment and question. It is actually the strategic use of the media, both an opportunity and also a great risk, of course, right? And the opportunity is there just because that's what is available, right? It is the media corporations and the media logics in which they operate is an opportunity to advance and to present in the hands of, in the eyes of the public, investigations in the public interest. After all, there is some room, and we have tested it. There is some room for, putting forward some investigations that are showing wrongdoing and are fighting for, achieving justice. And this is something that, for instance, people in Chile have understood very well with their movement in 2011. And here I am citing a very dear colleague of mine, Utman, who has identified very well how that movement used, the power that they had with the media to, and understood how the media operated, to present themselves as, someone who was, or a movement that was organized, and as a movement that was having some objectives in the public interest. So they fought against certain, for instance, conceptions that they had, or that the students had back then in Chile, by trying to, look for some interviews, or trying to produce statements and even some different products for media consumption that were feeding into the news cycle. So I'm kind of taking that that approach, or I'm borrowing that approach, so that, we can understand that then we can also try and use this news cycle to promote some of these investigations that we may have, from the academia, from the lab, right, from activism, from NGOs, so that established mainstream media and also alternative media can show some of these things, bearing in mind, the news cycle and how they operate. Being also a risk, right, because we are in contention with other narratives. I think that's definitely at stake. But at the same time, I think there are also other ways in which the narrative that can be pushed forward in the media can be legitimized, and there is where I can go back to the open research, or the open research from some of the projects from forensic architecture, where everything is there to be scrutinized and is publicly available for everyone to see. So that's one of the ways in which we can kind of try and make a difference between those who are trying to advance or make use of the media also for, actually some of the political projects that are not for the life in community, not for the public interest, but rather for the interest of very few. Well, that's what I can say about that, but it's obviously not kind of a finished argument.
Thanks a lot for that, Irving. I'm going to hand the floor over to Christina now for her response.
Sure. Thank you, Irving, and everyone for the organization. I find that your talk, Irving, was really wonderful to really connect us with a type of practice, a kind of embodied practice that comes from a very particular place and that has very particular lessons. I feel like the way that your own trajectory came to be, working from Mexico, having to confront the reality of that practice, leads us to understand journalism as a sort of frontline, right? As a way that that we can understand the production of truth, not as something, as a kind of a simple vocation, but as a complex battlefield that not only is contested, but that also implicates us the moment that it comes with a personal cost, right? So to be fired for doing your job, or to be fired perhaps is the better version of it, to be attacked from the stories we saw through the Pegasus stories from the NSO group, the way that journalists have been kind of targeted, hacked, but also kind of physically attacked for reporting, for doing what they are meant to do, means that we have a completely different way of operating to what we understand here, perhaps in the UK context, as like doing one's job, closing the books, going home, etc., etc. And so it is exactly this sort of type of journalism as frontline that implicates us personally, and that brings a sort of necessity for solidarity, a sort of necessity for thinking about both the practice and the profession in different terms. And I feel that it is exactly there that the question of objectivity comes into play in really interesting ways. Not to say that there is no objectivity because we have stakes at it, but to think perhaps through the kind of feminist critiques that are thinking about who is the subject of truth production, who is the subject of creating knowledge, and how could we account for the conditions that are involved in investigating those accounts. And in that, I think the way that you opened the talk, thinking about those kind of the insurrection of the gazes, the looking and looking again and looking again and again and again, is a beautiful way to bring that sort of multiplicity of voices that is necessary in order to create any sort of objective account, and to think of objectivity not as a monolithic God's eye view, as multiple kind of feminists have criticized, but to think about it as a cross-referenced, verified account that includes multiplicity in its very structure. This is the sort of model that perhaps forensic architecture is trying to promote, to think about the provenance of knowledge, to think about the provenance of each one of those accounts, and to really take time, right? To take time in a sense. I think the difference between the kind of classic journalistic model that you mentioned, the pressures of producing stories, of creating a sort of creating a kind of consumable product, right? And in relation to the investigative journalism, which requires a sort of slowing down, and requires a very careful deconstruction of truth and recomposing of truth. In that sense, perhaps kind of encapsulates that sort of way of that you mentioned of resisting the pressure of kind of neoliberal journalism in that sense. So I think it feels that what you're offering for us is a type of critique that is necessary in thinking about journalism, not only from a Eurocentric or UK-centric perspective, especially against this sort of, as Bob also mentioned, kind of, I mean, I'm not kind of trained as a journalist. I'm trained as an architect, but also from listening to Bob's account, this sort of way of being trained into exercising that universal voice that has this authority. How do we challenge that? How do we include some kind of also post-colonial perspectives? How do we understand it as a dominant as a dominant way of exercising truth practices? And how do we challenge it? Because especially at the times when that voice is the one that imposes a certain kind of what was it called in Ayotzinapa, the historic truth, right? Mm-hmm. The official truth, which is the condition that we have to work against. So it feels that what you're kind of mapping out here is all of the problems that come with the way that this practice has been working, and all of the ways that that kind of counter practices are springing out of necessity, out of the necessity to keep safe, to be able to fund your own work, to keep on doing the work, because it is important to still speak the truth, regardless of the challenges, and regardless of the way that truth as a field is a contested field, regardless of the way that multiple actors and often malevolent actors kind of create their own accounts and fight for it. And so I think, just in terms of the opening that you've offered us, I think it's a really rich way to understand the fields, and just perhaps a final thought before we kind of open it up in terms of your mention of aesthetics, which I found quite interesting. It feels to me that it is definitely this kind of fetishization of the image is something that, of course, we have to be wary of, but also to kind of think of not in terms of a binary, again, like to fall into the trap of using images and to fall into this production of images for the sake of consumption, but to think about aesthetics as something that is predominant in any field, to think about the aesthetics of text as well as the aesthetics of image, to think about the aesthetics of a newspaper and of that dominant voice, as well as the aesthetics of kind of sleek animations, etc., etc. Arguably, of course, any new medium that we introduce into the equation creates new rules for engagement. But I would hope that beyond kind of contributing to the production of images and to this kind of like overflow of abundance that makes it so difficult to read images, I hope that what we could start kind of steering towards and going towards and perhaps getting trained in is a certain particular eye for reading images and understanding images, reading aesthetic materials as the ways in which information gets encapsulated in a medium format, right? In media, which is, I guess, the question of media at large and within the context also of the school. So to think of aesthetics not only as something that is either appealing or not, but to think of it as the way in which information, hard kind of mined information that we've tried hard to figure out, to find, gets captured into particular forms, mm-hmm. whether that is a word, whether that is language, or whether that is visuals, or whether that is voice in whatever medium we find it in, to start trying to understand the power that is held within those forms. And I guess here I would also kind of welcome perhaps a more reflection in from your side as well, in being kind of in having worked in some of those investigations, in how you think we could make that sort of reading, that training in reading aesthetic materials a little bit more accessible.
So I completely agree that that there is always aesthetic to whatever we consume when it's mediated, and in and of itself, the image is not evil, right? It's not an idol in itself. Probably the point I was trying to make was that that craft, those artifacts, need to be made with a real purpose, and probably with also the aim of instructing people, or trying to establish a point in which people can learn to read these new media, so they can make sense of reality. How to do it? Well, that's a big enterprise, right? How to both produce and try to communicate with people it's a big question. I suppose that I mean we are in a continuum, right? So there are certain technologies that are still there. There are certain patterns of consumption of visuals that are still there. So I mean, trying to draw from those can be a question, and how to do it better, and the ethics of it is probably kind of the key to that. Is something that needs to be pushed forward as well, maybe as part of the political action of the investigative practice. You know? The ethical production and consumption of these images can be something that can be worked out. But these are just ideas, right? I mean, happy to discuss them, but it's an interesting point to look at, right? Just the other side of how people are consuming some of these aesthetic productions.
Thanks a lot for that, Christina and indeed Irving. I'm going to invite questions really from the audience. I've got one of my own that I'd like to ask, and this is a time when the audience can gather their questions. And I think we have one raised hand from David Garcia. Then we'll just come to that. And also you can type in the questions in the chat, and I can pick it up from there as well. Irving, one question that I had was that I was really struck. Not just by all the scholarship that exists on the cult of seeing and the sort of significance of visual aesthetic to the way in which truth is contested, and the kind of hegemonic prestige that is accorded to the visuality, because the text is merely an opinion, whereas something visual can be faked. I mean, within the digital sphere, sort of that thing is now challenged with deep fakes and with generative adversarial networks and GAN faces and the emergence of a visual culture that is by the day becoming closer and closer to another kind of multitude, to another kind of place where we have to confront this relativist argument where even visual culture can be extremely contested whilst looking very, very real and very, very well evidenced. So in this very neat and really provocative framework that you provided with in your presentation, how do we account, and what are your thoughts about GANs and deep fakes and the proliferation of videos that look very, very real, and what does that mean for digital journalism? So if you could comment on that.
Yeah, it is very interesting that you're asking that question. I usually find myself thinking about the fakes and what it entails for the investigative practice, which I think goes back to kind of a seminal work of the epistemology of investigative journalism. I can't remember the names right now of the authors, but it's kind of seminal in the field. And the postulation or the claim is that investigative journalists can never really prove events. They just back them up, which means that all the evidence can be infinitely verified or try to make legitimate, right? But the ultimate proof of an event happening, it is escapable, right? So deep fakes, I think they kind of show the core of that conundrum, right? We like to think that, oh, there is a video, there is an image that proves completely that something happened, but that actually could have been forged, right? It's just the advancement of technology that is kind of making that possible. So in that way, the investigative practice can never fully prove something. In a way, they can try to back it up. They can try to verify the provenance of things, and it is a constant struggle for proving something, right? And there are many ways of proving historical events, but at least that kind of sort of current of verification, it is an infinite or kind of a work that is never ending, as it were, right? I don't know if that kind of resonates with the debates of deepfakes, but in a way, deepfakes show us that even those images that we think that are legitimate and true, they can be forged, and that's why we need to continue the struggle, as it were, right, for verification, for backing facts.
Thank you for that, Irving. I'm sure there's a lot to talk through still.